Yeah, so I like your point about American realism because this is a distinction that I think oftentimes people aren't tracking, and I get why not, because if you look at something like what happened on January 6th, it's so dramatic in the kind of basic optics of it. And it feels like such a natural fit with a narrative that a lot of people had about Trumpism in general, maybe that it's, I mean, look, if you're the same way that if you're an anarchist who thinks that, like, we're the way that we're going to get, better system is like street level insurrection. You saw the police station burning down in Minneapolis. You thought, hey, look, right, it's happening.
Yeah.
um and
Been happening since 1968. It's
yeah, it's a particularly dramatic instance.
The Chaz too, especially as someone who's from Seattle, there were a lot of, I think, fantasies about what the Chaz represented. Regardless of whether you think of it, I just don't think it represented a foundation for a break with actually existing America.
Yeah, I mean, presumably not, right? Like there wasn't going to be like I mean, there was no scenario into which there was going to be a long-term Chaz with like the like even just basic like water, sewer, electric stuff. That wasn't going to happen.
Right.
But
literally, though, I this reminded me of Occupy, and when I heard the audio of the guy, whatever, this strange provocateur person who had the really disturbing video of Ashley Babbitt getting shot, like they were saying, this is happening, and I'm like, these are exactly the words I heard on Occupy, like the first march out of Zuccotti, like the whole "it's all happening" thing. Like, this is exactly the same kind of like triumphalism. We're on the cusp. It is, it's the same kind of insane confidence of spirit that's like, this time it's happening, and like obviously totally different visions of what they want to happen and visions for the world. But it's like, Americans are really fucking easily convinced that it's all happening every time. They get us every time. The Lucy with the football.
Right.
I think raises a lot of interesting questions, but the one that jumps immediately to mind is like, why don't we just appreciate the sheer power of the American security state, which is, puts down these things basically when it decides to, without exaggeration. If it decides to go after you, you're not going to come out well from that equation. And so it's interesting that that's a delusion that sort of permeates the United States, which maybe
that you can have either in a way that you'd welcome, like the sort of reading insurrectionary fantasies into Chaz or the Minneapolis police station as if these were real threats to the American state, or in a apocalyptic doomer sort of way, like thinking that what happened on January 6th was like a potential fascist coup, that was going to end democracy or something like that. And again, if you're just looking at the imagery, and a kind of blurry watercolor of what happened, you can kind of see how somebody could get there, even though, if nothing else, to dramatically underestimating this stability and strength of the American state, which for better or for worse, very often for worse, is not vulnerable to these things. But I think it's also interesting, Amber.
QAnon people seem to think, like, the left seems to think that, like, everyone's just going to be so moved by whatever public gesture we do that they're going to, they're like, oh, look, they really care about this. We should probably stop police violence, or we should probably forgive student debt, or whatever.
Right.
Like, Q thinks like, oh, actually, they're on our side. Like, the security service are secretly on our side. We get it. It's a lot of like sort of like augury and the kind of delusion that, whatever Freud said, there's little difference between the schizophrenic and the philosopher. Both read a conspiracy into the text. Like, the idea that, like, leftists sort of know that we're against people, but we think that, like, if we're inspiring enough, that our will alter the world.
Right.
And Q, the complete opposite. They're like, oh no, they're they're low key. They're gonna any minute now they're gonna come out and be like, I too support you. So it's like,
yeah, which I mean, in a way, it's almost like the early years of the Obama administration, the widespread belief that Obama was playing 9-dimensional chess, and and really, he wanted everything that the left wanted. He was just being like very savvy and subtle, and he wasn't going to show his hand. It's kind of the same thing for Trump, but what the actual vision is, and this is one important distinction. Like one of even the relatively saner comparisons I've seen, as far from people who see, the sort of specter of fascism in this, is obviously not to something like the March on Rome or whatever. Those things worked, but to 1934 in France, when there were fascist fascist, who were sacking government buildings in similar ways, but if you look at the ideology of those forces back then, like they actually had like what they called anti-parliamentary leagues. Like they were very explicit, like democracy bad, we don't like it. And in this case, there is no vision of anything except the basic American system. There might be a vision of murdering a lot of the people in it because you think they're satanic pedophiles. But certainly not changing any of the actual institutions. That would just be unimaginable.
Right, which is that American realist aspect that I talk about, because I think this country has obviously a very imperfect democracy, but its institutions have lasted in a relatively coherent fashion for a long time, which just wasn't true about post-World War I Italy or especially post-World War I Germany, which goes from being a monarchy to a democracy in a year. And so that's just a fundamentally different thing.
Right.
Which, as you know, I've always said blah, blah, blah. But I think that it's interesting when you're examining this movement, particularly how to respond to that, to really take it seriously. And I think that's what our piece was trying to do, which was to take the QAnon people on their own terms and see, like, what are they actually saying beyond the things that we could just, put in the box of Fantasia. Because I don't think you need to get into the details about like what do they think about the satanic pedophiles. It really gets into eschatology. It's a Bible code. They have people like really tracking everything Q wrote, but like what are they actually saying in terms of like a programmatic statement? And it's pretty status quo, ironically. They're not suggesting new forms of governance. They're not suggesting new institutions. They're not suggesting a new constitution. They're not suggesting get rid of the Senate. It's very much within this American paradigmatic democratic frame, which is very interesting and a little bit unusual in terms of millenarian movements. It's sad and depressing and tragic.
Yeah. So, and I think one of the things that's particularly depressing and tragic about it is some of, without reducing everything to this, there are obviously like real, there is real suffering, in a larger sense that's channeled into this. Like one of the things that you mentioned in the article is that one of the most common Q beliefs was that Donald Trump was going to forgive everybody's medical debt. You've just watched part of a Give Them More patron bonus episode. To access the full episode and every other episode, sign up as a patron at patreon.com/Ben Burgis.